Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Gäste, es ist mir eine ganz besondere Freude und Ehre, Ihnen allen Professor David Burgstahler vorzustellen. Er zählt zu den weltweit herausragenden Wissenschaftlern im Fachgebiet Accounting, also Rechnungslegung und Publizität. Burgstahler, ja, trotz seines deutsch klingenden Namens ist David Burgstahler gebürtiger US-Amerikaner. Er ist verheiratet, hat einen Sohn. Nach Studium und Promotion begann er seine akademische Karriere an der University of Washington, der er bis heute treu geblieben ist. Das wundert einen eigentlich nicht. Wer die University of Washington an der Ostküste sucht, der liegt nämlich völlig falsch. Ihr Name rührt nämlich vom Bundesstaat Washington her und sie liegt in der schönen Stadt Seattle, die in einer wunderbaren landschaftlichen Lage am Pazifik gesegnet ist, also auch sehr geeignet zum Bootfahren. Die Familie hat auch ein eigenes Boot. Auch die Universität selbst hat einen schönen Campus. Ja, aber das ist nicht das Entscheidende. Die Forschung dort am Department of Accounting selber besitzt Weltgeltung, wie verschiedene Rankings belegen, in denen sie auf den ersten und sogar auf den allerersten Plätzen zu finden ist. David Burgstahler hat maßgeblich dazu beigetragen. Es ist kaum möglich, seine bisherigen Leistungen annähernd zu umreißen. Laut VHB-Ranking hat er über 15 A-Publikationen in weltweit führenden Zeitschriften. Seine Arbeiten werden von zahlreichen anderen Wissenschaftlern aufgegriffen und tausendfach zitiert. Aufgrund seiner Ausnahmestellung im Fach ist er seit Jahrzehnten Gutachter für namhafte Zeitschriften und bei Konferenzen und er ist auch im Herausgeberbeirat bei verschiedenen Zeitschriften tätig und stellt so sein Können in den Dienst der Wissenschaft. Ja, was führt ihn nun zu uns in diese alte Welt? Das sind einerseits persönliche Beziehungen, andererseits gemeinsame fachliche Interessen. Der persönliche Kontakt besteht schon 3 Jahren. Er geht aus von einem längeren Forschungsaufenthalt von Dr. Defrimi Kaya, einem hoffnungsvollen Jungwissenschaftler im FACT-Institut. Dr. Kaya zog in die Welt, um auf der University of Washington neue Erfahrungen und Perspektiven zu gewinnen und hieraus entwickelte sich eine Zusammenarbeit mit David Burgstahler und auch dessen Interesse an einem umgekehrten Aufenthalt bei uns in Nürnberg. Das fachlich gemeinsame Bindeglied ist die Rechnungslegung. Die Forschungsschwerpunkte von David Burgstahler liegen im Bereich Earnings Management, also Bilanzpolitik, und in der empirischen Rechnungslegungsforschung speziell bei börsennotierten Unternehmen. Das FACT-Institut und speziell auch Defrimi Kaya kann hingegen auf Know-how zur Publizitätspolitik gerade bei mittelständischen Unternehmen zurückgreifen. Deutschland ist bekanntermaßen durch einen starken Mittelstand geprägt, dessen Erfolge auf Weitsicht, langfristigem Denken, Schnelligkeit und Flexibilität beruhen. Tja, das Verhältnis mittelständischer Unternehmen zur Bilanzierung ist etwas angespannt, allerdings es lässt sich so ungefähr mit einem Zahnarztbesuch vergleichen. Dessen Notwendigkeit wird meist akzeptiert, ohne dass damit ausufernde Freude verbunden wäre und den man deshalb vielleicht auch einige Zeit gern hinauszögert. Nicht ganz zu Unrecht laufen KMU doch Gefahr, dass Konkurrenten hieraus Vorteile ziehen. Die Analyse des Publizitätsverhaltens von KMU ist deshalb keine rein wissenschaftliche Neugier, sondern auch von enormer praktischer Relevanz für Wirtschaft und Gesetzgeber und damit auch die Gesellschaft. In den USA fehlen hierzu geeignete empirische Daten. Für empirische Analysen bilden sich hingegen Deutschland und die ganze EU an. Eine Symbiose amerikanischer und europäischer Know-hows bietet hier spannende Ergebnisse, die wir erwarten können. Darüber hinaus gibt es natürlich über dieses ursprüngliche Projekt oder Einstiegsprojekt noch weitere fachliche Anknüpfungspunkte mit Gewinn für beide Seiten. Deswegen wurde diese Bewerbung nicht von mir persönlich, sondern vom gesamten FACT-Institut, also das sind 8 Lehrstühle und Professuren, sowie auf Seiten des wissenschaftlichen Nachwuchses 2 Juniorprofessuren einhellig getragen. Professor David Burgstahler ist aufgrund seines herausragenden Ansehens, Wissens, seiner Erfahrungen und Kontakte ein unschätzbarer Gewinn für den Fachbereich und die Region. Lieber David, es ist mir persönlich eine große Ehre, Sie heute zur Festveranstaltung des Dr. Theo und Friedel Schöller Forschungszentrums für Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft vorzustellen. Ich darf Sie zu mir bitten. Meine Damen und Herren, Schöller Senior Fellow 2014, David Burgstahler. Congratulations.
Well, I have just a few minutes here, and I've got two important purposes. The first one is the one that I want to make sure I don't screw up, and that's to thank you very much. So I want to say thank you to the Schöller Foundation and the selection committee, to Klaus Hanselman. I really appreciate his support, and Dr. Devrimikaya. It's all very important. Professor Amberg mentioned the importance of this. There's obviously a financial importance to it, but the recognition importance is far more important. And so I really appreciate that. To give a little context for that, you know, I have a family, my parents and my brothers and sisters, and I think one of the purposes of your family is to keep you humble. And so one of the nice things about this award is I could say, they actually want me to come over to Germany and provide an award and recognize me. And of course, my family all kind of looks at me funny, but I'm able to say, you know, I actually am being recognized, and I appreciate that very much. So thank you again for this award. The other thing that I want to do is provide a brief description of the research project that we're undertaking. And so I've got a slide to try to summarize that here. So the project is about the social benefits of regulation, which are always accompanied by private costs. And regulators are always trying to find the right balance between these two things. Imposing more regulation, it always has benefits that are intended, but it almost always has costs that are not intended as well. So let's see if I can get this to work properly. So in weighing these two things against each other, we're going to take a look at two types of regulation. The primary interest is disclosure regulation. And there's a lot of regulation in Europe with regard to public disclosure of information. And the benefits for that are shown on the left side of this scale. There's public information about limited liability firms. There's all sorts of economic and social advantages to that. But at the same time, on the other side of the scale, there's a cost of disclosure of information to competitors, and that's kind of the unintended consequence. The purpose of disclosure is not to put firms at a competitive disadvantage, but it's to gain all those other advantages that are on the left side. Now, along with that, we also need to investigate another type of related disclosure, and I'll explain a little bit more why this is linked, but let me talk about this other type of regulation, and that's audit regulation. So in many cases, there also are requirements, no, I'm not doing this properly, requirements for audits, okay? And the benefits of audits, of course, is you have independently verified information, and so the information that's being released is both more reliable but also more credible. On the other side of the scale there, we've got private costs, which is the direct cost of the audit, but we've also got private benefits. So there's contracting benefits of having audited information. And so we've got both these areas of regulation, and it turns out in Europe, both those areas of regulation are directly linked to measures of size. So larger firms are subject to more regulation, and regulators have generally been concerned about disproportionate adverse effects on smaller firms. And so that's the reason that regulation in both these areas is linked to size. The larger you are, the more disclosure is required. The larger a firm is, the more likely they are to be subject to audit regulations. So the basic theme of this research is to use the European setting and the disclosure requirements in Europe to see if there's evidence that firms manage their size to stay small enough to avoid being subject to this regulation. So we have a lot of theory and a lot of models about the effect of disclosure and the potential adverse effects of disclosure, but we actually have relatively little empirical evidence on the effects of disclosure. And the European setting provides us an opportunity to look at this. Now, the approach we're going to take is related to some other research that I've done, which is you look for evidence that items are being managed. And so I've done a lot of evidence on earnings management. Well, here we're actually looking at size management. We're looking at firms managing their size to stay below the disclosure thresholds and avoid having to disclose. Now, the reason that disclosure and auditing are so closely linked here is that the thresholds for audit requirements tend to overlap in a lot of European countries with the thresholds for additional disclosure requirements. So oftentimes firms have a dual incentive to manage size to stay small enough to avoid disclosure and also avoid the costs of audits. So what we can do is we can look at distributions of size, and what you would expect to see that firms will take actions to stay just below the threshold. So I've got 3 fairly small graphs of the kind of evidence that we're going to look at here, and I'm hoping they'll show up large enough you'll get a little sense of what we're trying to do. So this first graph is a graph of one measure of size, which is total assets, for German firms. That red bar that you see in the middle is the threshold, where if you go above that threshold, you're required to make additional disclosure. Now this variable, like a lot of size variables in economics, has this kind of declining shape, sort of an exponential distribution shape for those of you that are more technically inclined. And you would expect that distribution to be fairly smooth, and if there weren't some reason to manage size around threshold, you wouldn't expect there to be any discontinuity at the point where you see that threshold. And in fact, what you see instead is as you get to that threshold, there's a lot of firms that stay just below that threshold, and then when you get just above the threshold, there aren't very many firms there. The theory would be that those firms that would have gone above the threshold have found ways to keep their total assets below what that threshold is. And for those of you that are not accountants, it turns out there's quite a few things you can do from an accounting standpoint to affect the amount of your total assets. So aside from the economic assets that you have, you've got the accounting measure of the assets, which is going to determine the extent to which you're subject to this regulation. The threshold in Germany during this time period, the threshold for disclosure requirements and audit requirements were the same. So this evidence that we're seeing for Germany is evidence that firms are managing size to avoid both those types of regulation. Now, there are some settings in Europe where the disclosure and audit regulations thresholds are separate. And the final 2 graphs that I'm going to talk about show you those 2 things. So the first one is for French data. And this again is the distribution of total assets, and this is with respect to the threshold that determines whether you're subject to disclosure regulation. And here you don't really see any discontinuity at that red line. It's a slight bump upwards, but nothing that's statistically significant. Now, during this same time period, the French firms had a different threshold for being subject to audit regulation. And if we look at the distribution of total assets with respect to the audit threshold, we actually do see a discontinuity. And it's not quite as prominent as it was in the German distribution there, but again, it's significant. So what this starts to suggest is that we've got evidence here that firms are taking actions to avoid audits. But we have less evidence for the same country, for the same variable, but with respect to a different threshold, that they're taking actions to avoid disclosure. So this just allows us to start to assess the importance of disclosure costs versus audit costs. We have some assessments of how costly audits are. We have some assessments of the private benefits of audits as well as the private costs. And that suggests that the disclosure costs, at least in this setting in France during this time period, may not be as large. Now, the plan is to extend all of this research to additional European countries. In the end, I don't think we'll evaluate all those countries. Right now, it looks like we have pretty good access to data for 12 of those countries. And we'll get a much better set of empirical evidence on the importance of disclosure costs. And along with that, as kind of a corollary result, some additional evidence on the importance of audit costs. So let me return once again to kind of the main point of my talk, which again is to say thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. I appreciate very much the Schöller Foundation. And as I say, I appreciate this recognition. I'll take it back and tell my family all about it. Thank you.